Good evening. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute in the Bush School of Government. I'd like to welcome you this evening to our program. This is the fourth Scowcroft event for 2018, and I'm pleased to welcome my very good friend of many years, Greg Scarlatoiu, to Texas A&M and to the Bush School. He is a scholar and practitioner who writes extensively on North Korea's human rights situation and the operation of its regime. He is relied on by the State Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council, members of the United States Congress on North Korea because of his extensive experience and his knowledge. He has over 6 years of experience in international development working on projects funded by USAID, the World Bank, the Africa Development Bank. For 14 years, he has authored and broadcast the weekly Korea language Scarlatoiu column on North Korea for Radio Free Asia. Mr. Scarlatoiu holds a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, a master's degree from Seoul National University's Department of International Relations. He is a graduate of the MIT Seminar 21 for U.S. National Security Leaders. He was awarded the title of Citizen of Honor from the city of Seoul, Korea. I believe his wife is South Korean, and he speaks. It's remarkable in the number of languages he speaks. You speak, obviously, English and Romanian. He was born in Romania, and Korean fluently, but French? German? No German. Okay. That's enough. He is fluent in Korean. I just mentioned that. And he was born and raised during the communist dictatorship. He is a naturalized U.S. citizen. He serves currently as the executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. I co-chaired with Roberta Cohen the committee for 3 years, I don't remember how many, 4 years? 4 years, okay. And I still sit on the board of directors, which he had no choice but to accept our invitation to come this evening, but I didn't have to push him at all. He came voluntarily. He does this across the country. And I just want to tell you, now I'm bragging a little bit about the committee. The committee was formed 20 years ago, and I think I joined the board of directors 10 or 12 years ago. We produce research reports, and they are very, very high quality. And I'll just tell you a story. In 2000, I think it was 2012, when we issued the report on the political prison camps. Prior to that, you know, we might, when we went and have a press conference and invite policymakers in Washington to the event, and we release a report, you know, we might get 30, 40 people. This, I don't know, we had 200 people at it. 250 people. The Washington Post wrote a column on it, editorial on it, got into the New York Times, The Economist. We were a little taken aback ourselves by this massive, almost 10-time increase in the number of people at this, and then all of a sudden the issue blew up. I don't know if any of you watched President Trump's State of the Union address, in which he introduced this North Korean who escaped and had been damaged and tortured as a young boy, and he held his crutches up. Well, Greg was one of the prime movers in orchestrating his visit and then making the arrangements to have him attend the session. I don't know if he'll tell you about it. They told me some interesting stories as to how he did it. Anyway, the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea also is the institution that first proposed, I believe, that the United Nations create a high commission on human rights abuses in North Korea, crimes against humanity. The Chief Justice of the Australian Supreme Court and the Attorney General of Indonesia and the leader of the NGO committee in Serbia were the three members of the commission that produced a 265-page report that detailed the crimes against humanity, and they recommended at the end that Kim Jongun be indicted. Or Kim Jong-il, was it? Or when did we produce it? Kim Jongun be 2014, be indicted for crimes against humanity. UN, if you know the United, they do not issue reports like this ever. It was quite shocking, and we were extremely pleased that this happened. But the chairman of that commission is now on our advisory board. Is that not right? Yes. So he is, Greg has been a major figure. In fact, I would say the major figure in making the human rights situation in North Korea a national issue and an international issue. We now have supporters across the globe saying, how did the West, how did democracies across the world allow this regime to get away with these atrocities, these crimes against humanity for so long, and no one said anything? And I don't want to exaggerate this, but Greg is more responsible than almost anyone else. There are many organizations involved in this, but he is one of the leaders. And so I think we're going to be treated this evening to an expert, technical expert, but also someone who cares deeply about human rights and the dignity of the individual person. Greg, please.
Well, Andrew, Ambassador Natsios, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm humbled. It's an extraordinary honor to be your guest today, and it is very special for my Eastern European soul to be speaking here at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library. Both President George H.W. Bush and President Reagan were very special to us Eastern Europeans. I was a freshman at Bucharest University in December 1989 when communism fell. I was right in the midst of it. I left a few months later. I left for South Korea, so those memories are still vivid. I still have memories of that world, dominated, unfortunately for us at the time, by the Soviets. My mission today is easy. I have about 45 minutes to talk to you about North Korea, about its policy of human rights denial, and about the links between its appalling human rights situation and the grave political security challenges it poses. We will begin with the basics. We all know that South Korea is a true democracy, an economic powerhouse, a fully responsible state that was once a recipient of international humanitarian development security assistance, has now become a provider of such assistance, has given the world a UN Secretary General, has given the world a president of the World Bank who is an American citizen but was born in South Korea and lived there as a child. In contrast with South Korea and many other countries in the region that have benefited from decades of tremendous economic, social, political development, North Korea has remained a black hole on the map of Northeast Asia. North Korea's population is about half that of South Korea's, 25 million. North Korea's economic performance continues to be appalling. The North Korean regime is very good at doing a set of things, producing nuclear weapons, producing long-range ballistic missiles, producing other tools of death. And of course, this is a regime that has developed for decades expertise in maiming, torturing, oppressing its own people. So how did we get here? Well, we're all familiar with the Korean War and the fact that there is no peace treaty. There is just an armistice that was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. Something else happened in July 1953. On March the 5th of that year, Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, died. From that point on, many in Eastern Europe and even the Soviets under Nikita Khrushchev began flirting with concepts such as peaceful coexistence with the liberal democracies of the West. This was unacceptable to Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea at the time, who realized that he had to put in place his own version of national communism. You've often heard this question. It has been almost 29 years since the fall of communism in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. This regime of the Kim family is still around today. How was this possible? One possible explanation is that this regime is the result of the fusion of three totalitarian political systems. Prior to the communist takeover in 1945, Eastern Europeans had experienced other political systems, good, bad, terrible, but nevertheless, they were memories of a different world. In the case of North Korea, all North Koreans knew was Stalinist communism brought to them on top of Soviet tanks. Prior to that, 40 years, 1905 to 1945, 40 years of very brutal, ruthless Japanese imperial occupation. And prior to that, just 500 years of feudalism, 500 years of feudal Joseon dynasty. I don't mean this as an insult to the Joseon dynasty. There are a lot of wonderful things about the Joseon dynasty, but Kim Il-sung simply borrowed the worst he could find in these three totalitarian political systems. He added it his own touch, and from that point on, he began developing the system that we know today in North Korea. Everything became our style from that point on. The regime developed the philosophy of juche, the doctrine of self-reliance, which is quite different from Marxism. In Marxism, ownership of the means of production is the main driver of history. In juche, the individual is the main driver of history, but don't be fooled. This is no Western individualism. It's very different. It's the individual as part of the termite mound. One's life makes sense only for as long as he or she spends his or her entire life working for the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth equals the supreme leader. This is juche. In order to understand North Korea, one has to remember that there are truly four fundamental building blocks of the Kim family regime. One of them is the inner core of the Kim family. The other one is the Korean Workers' Party, the KWP, the Korean People's Army, the KPA, and the internal security agencies. For a population of 25 million people, North Korea has 270,000 internal security agents. The Ministry of Public Security is their their quasi-police force that also executes political police functions. They have 210,000 agents. The SSD, the State Security Department, has 50,000 agents. That's the North Korean Gestapo or Stasi, however you want to see it. And then there's the Military Security Command, the MSC, 10,000 agents. The mission of the MSC is to conduct surveillance of officers, in particular senior KPA officers. The system is highly stovepiped. All four building blocks are important. At the same time, the system works only with a Kim at the top. Is there an agency that is most powerful in North Korea today? The answer is yes, and that would be the Organization and Guidance Department, the OGD, within the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party. What is the OGD? I would describe the OGD as a human resources department on steroids. When, in 1974, Kim Jong-il began preparing for becoming leader of North Korea, he became leader of North Korea 20 years later, when his father, Kim Il-sung, died in July 1994. Kim Jong-il was the one who began developing the OGD into an all-powerful agency that became his main power base. They call the shots, they demote, they promote people, they decide who lives and who dies. They're the ones who advise the supreme leader on policy guidance. They're the ones who transmit policy guidance all the way down the chain of command to the local level. They're the ones who assess compliance with directives received from the supreme leader. Cho Young-jun, who was until very recently head of the OGD, was known as the Angel of Death. Choseong의 사자 for the Korean speakers in the audience. When the fellow showed up, you knew that you were dead, basically. That was it. This is how powerful this agency has become under Kim Jong-un as well. They continue to be powerful because, unlike his father, he only had 3 years and not 20 to prepare. He was in a mad rush to create his own power base. Unlike the father, he was very young. When he became leader of North Korea, he was only 27 years old. He turned 28 the following month, in January 2012. The father was 53 years old when he became leader. So because Kim Jong-un was in such a terrible rush to create his own power base, he initiated a purge on par with the great purges of the 1950s. In the 1950s, as Kim Il-sung was establishing himself as leader of North Korea, he purged all dissenters, enemies of the revolution, enemies within the revolution. Basically, who was purged? Well, landowners, former entrepreneurs, Christians. By the way, North Korea used to be the cradle of the Korean Presbyterian Church. The capital city of Pyongyang used to be known as the Jerusalem of the East. You're talking religion, and you're talking Christianity, and you're talking a way of life. 2 churches on each street corner. Christianity, all religions, but Christianity in particular, was purged with extreme prejudice. People were killed, people were sent to political prison camps. Many people came down as refugees to South Korea. That is why the Presbyterian community in South Korea is so strong today. South Korea used to be the cradle of the Methodist community in Korea. That is also one reason why Presbyterian churches are so involved in activities that have to do with human rights in North Korea, helping rescue refugees, protecting refugees, and so on and so forth. So Kim Il-sung was the one who initiated these great purges. He purged the pro-Chinese faction within the party. He purged the pro-Soviet faction within the party. Some of these local factions that posed a threat. This process has continued all the way to the days of Kim Jong-un. But again, the purges going on under Kim Jong-un's leadership are on par with what his grandfather did in the 1950s. According to the Seoul-based Institute for National Security Strategy, INSS, this is an institute staffed with many senior North Korean defectors, during the first 5 years of the Kim Jong-un regime, 340 senior officials were purged, demoted, and executed. Remember, I mentioned feudalism. North Korea has a system of guilt by association called Yeonjaje. This is a system of feudal extraction. Up to 3 generations of the same family are punished for the perceived wrongdoing of one family member. So these have been massive purges. The entire bureaucratic support structure is taken out from underneath. Colleagues, associates, family members. Some are simply purged as scapegoats. The regime makes a mistake. In late 2009, they came up with a confiscatory currency reform that was meant to wipe out the savings of those active at North Korea's black markets and gray markets. Things took a pretty bad turn for the Kim regime. People were burning North Korean currency, North Korean banknotes. What is the problem with burning banknotes? The face of Kim Il-sung is on the banknotes. So, well, they found a scapegoat, this fellow whose name was Park Nam-gi, who was the director of finance and planning within the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party. Basically, they had him executed. Why am I bringing up the purges? Under the Kim Jong-un regime, representatives of all 4 fundamental building blocks of the North Korean regime have been executed. I don't mean to be dropping names on you, but the military, one example, Vice Marshal Lee Yong-ho, he was supposed to become Kim Jong-un's mentor, one of the 8 men walking by Kim Jong-il's hearse. He was demoted, purged, executed in the summer of 2012. Party, the best example is that of the uncle, Chang Song-taek, who was executed in December 2013. Of course, the uncle was also a member of the inner core of the Kim family regime. He was a member of the family, not a blood relative, not a member of the Paektu bloodline, but nevertheless a very important character, Kim Il-sung's only son-in-law. Security agencies as well. Ryu Gyong, vice chairman of the Gestapo, the State Security Department, also demoted and executed. The favorite method of execution, and as Andrew knows very well, we have actually been able to acquire a satellite image just minutes before such an execution took place at Kangon Military Academy, not too far from Pyongyang. The favorite method of execution is execution by ZPU-4 anti-aircraft machine gun. You're talking 4 machine gun barrels, 50 caliber automatic fire. Bodies are just pulverized, turned into pink mist. This is how senior officials are punished. I was not able to confirm until a few months ago the uncle was executed basically using the same method. So Kim Jong-un, just like his predecessors, just like the father and grandfather, within the world of North Korea, is a rational actor executing a set of fundamental strategic objectives. The ultimate strategic objective of this regime is its own survival. So I will never argue that the Kims have been madmen. In the case of Kim Jong-un, he became very powerful at a very young age. He had his uncle, his own uncle, executed with a ZPU-4 anti-aircraft machine gun system, and his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, assassinated last year at a busy international airport in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, with a weapon of mass destruction. VX nerve agent. So is Kim Jong-un a little bit off compared even to the father or grandfather? Perhaps a little bit, one might argue. Of course, Kim Il-sung could not execute all of the perceived wrongdoers, all of the enemies of the revolution, enemies within the revolution. So from Stalin, he got the idea of setting up a political prison camp system. He got this idea early on. They created a system of political prison camps modeled upon the Soviet model. The situation is so bad that comparisons have been made with the Nazi Holocaust. This has been described as a slow-motion Holocaust, and also with the Russian Gulag. As Professor Natsios mentioned earlier, a UN Commission of Inquiry submitted a report to the UN Human Rights Council in February 2014, a report that found that what is happening in North Korea, especially at North Korea's political prison camps, where prisoners are subjected to relentless malnutrition, torture, forced labor, public, secret executions, what is happening at these facilities amounts to crime against humanity committed pursuant to orders coming from the highest level of the state and policies established at the highest level of the state. Based on satellite imagery analysis and defector testimony, we speak to former guards, former prisoners, former officials who used to be in charge of running these camps. The current prison camp population is 120,000 people, men, women, children, held at 5, if not 6, such detention facilities. The kwalliso, which in Korean means a management place, a place where you manage people. There are many other types of facilities in North Korea. For example, the kyohwa-so, re-education through labor, through forced labor camps. We know for a fact that political prisoners are also held there. Misdemeanor level prisons, Chikyo-so labor training centers, Kuryujang, and mobile labor brigades, Nodong Talyonde. So while 120,000 is the number of political prisoners, there are many other prisoners and many political prisoners held at other types of facilities. This is our friend Shin Dong-hyuk, was born at one such camp. This is a meeting with the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Skokie, Illinois. We've had the opportunity to have survivors of political prison camps meet with Holocaust survivors, share their experiences. Just a very quick example of satellite imagery. We were the first organization to use satellite imagery to investigate North Korea's political prison camps. Remember, this is the world's most reclusive regime. We have developed a methodology that overcomes the lack of access through the use of testimony by victims, former guards, and also satellite imagery. North Korea is the only country on the face of the planet that discriminates against its own people and classifies its own people based on their perceived loyalty to the regime. North Korea has a system called Songun People. I won't say citizens, I'll say the subjects of the Kim regime are classified into three categories. Core class, 20 to 25% of the population. Wavering class, 40 to 60% of the population. And hostile class, 20 to 25% of the population. Many of those in the hostile class are sent to political prison camps, other detention facilities. Many of them are banished to remote areas in the Northeast. For example, Professor Natsios wrote the best book ever written on the North Korean famine, where he made the point that the North Korean regime intentionally severed access, basically condemned these groups that ranked low in the Songun system to a certain death, practically, during the days of the famine. Well, while the people of North Korea starved to death in the mid to the late 1990s, we also know quite a bit about the lifestyle of North Korea's leaders. How do we know it? We know it from a fellow named Fujimoto Kenji, who was Kim Jong-il's chef, sushi chef. He wrote a book entitled, you guessed, I was Kim Jong-il's chef, where he basically disclosed the lifestyle of the late leader of North Korea, this fellow, the Japanese chef who traveled the world buying only the best caviar from Uzbekistan and Iran, beer from Czechoslovakia, pork from Denmark, fish from Japan. The wine cellars held thousands and tens of thousands of bottles of wine. The Kims have their villas and their humongous buildings, an unbelievable lifestyle, confirmed, by the way, by Dennis Rodman, who traveled to North Korea and met with Kim Jong-un. They spent some time together on Kim Jong-un's Pleasure Island, which Dennis Rodman described as Kim Jong-un's Ibiza, only with no people on it, just Kim Jong-un and his people. And this is happening while the regime is developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, investing tremendously in those tools of death, while 30% of North Korea's children are malnourished, while the overwhelming majority of North Koreans continues to suffer from severe human security deficiencies, from severe human insecurity. I mentioned Songbun earlier. Just one quick example. This lady, by the way, was part of the group that met with President Trump on Friday last week. She was one of the 8. Just to tell you that Songbun and loyalty is not a two-way road in North Korea. This lady was a choreographer in North Korea. She's in her early 80s right now. She was the youngest sister of a hero of the People's Republic, a hero of the DPRK. Her brother was a lieutenant colonel in the Korean People's Army, who was part of the officer corps that launched the surprise attack against South Korea on June the 25th, 1950. He died on August the 12th, 1950, shot through the heart because she was the sister of a hero of the Republic. She lived the life of the elites. Unfortunately for her, she got to know Song Hae-rim, who was Kim Jong-il's mistress at the time, later became the mother of Kim Jong-nam. Kim Jong-nam, the fellow, the brother, half-brother who was assassinated in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So basically, the security agents found out that she knew about this. They came to her house, told her to pack her bags because she was going to a performance somewhere in the provinces. They took her away with her entire family. She spent 8 years at political prison camp number 15, Yodok. She lost her entire family, except for one son. She buried them with her own hands. She rolled them up in straw mats and buried them. Eventually, she managed to leave the camp. The camp commander got to find out who she was. She spent many more years in North Korea, then eventually managed to escape to South Korea, write a book, and tell her story. Continues to be very active today. And I was very happy to know that she had this opportunity to meet with President Trump. It's a very big deal at this stage in her life, at this age, in her early 80s. after all that she's gone through, there is a lot that she still has to share with all of us. Well, going back to Juche, Kim Il-sung preached Juche ideology to the North Koreans. We are self-sufficient. We don't need anybody, the Chinese or the Russians or anybody else. Well, this was very far from the truth. They were actually very dependent on aid and subsidized imports from the Soviet Union, China, fraternal communist states, fertilizer in particular. They engaged in irrational deforestation. They ended up with soil erosion, soil depletion on their hands. Flooding gets very serious in the summer during the rainy season in both South and North Korea. Flooding was exacerbated by deforestation. So basically they ended up for this reason with, crops being wiped out, and a great famine that killed anywhere between 600,000 and 3 million North Koreans. Hwang Jang-yeop, the highest ever defector to come out of North Korea, the very author of the Juche doctrine, his assessment was closer to the 3 million dead in the famine. Of course, not everybody died of hunger. Some people died of disease because immune systems had been affected by malnutrition. There had been relatively few North Koreans who managed to escape and find their way to South Korea before that. The number of North Koreans who have resettled in South Korea today is 31,000. There are more in other countries, including, I believe, 217 in the United States as of now. Their presence outside North Korea has been very important. They've told us their stories. We have learned a lot about how North Korea works, about how the regime operates from many of these escapees. We do have an issue with China. China could make a huge difference in terms of the plight of North Korean refugees. China is a party to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. According to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and the 1967 Additional Protocol, if a person is returned to his or her own country where it faces a credible fear of persecution, you can see Articles 1 and 33 of the Convention. If that person faces a credible fear of persecution, they qualify to receive access to the process leading to acquiring political refugee status. When North Koreans are arrested and forcibly returned by China, they're basically tortured, interrogated, asked two basic questions. Did you come across any South Koreans? And did you come across any Christians? Why are they afraid of South Korea and Christianity? Obviously because these are two systems, one religious, the other one political, that pose a serious challenge to the dictatorship of the Kim regime. China continues to argue that they are illegal economic migrants and continues to forcibly repatriate them. Of course, North Korea today is different from North Korea 20 years ago. The famine drastically changed North Korea. Prior to the famine, the overwhelming majority of people depended on the public distribution system, on the PDS. The regime had demonetized the economy and turned food into a tool of social control. Everyone depended on coupons, rations, on the public distribution system. That system collapsed during the days of the famine. They haven't been able to rebuild it. Instead, markets have developed in North Korea. Informal markets, black markets. Many more people depend on these informal and black markets today than they do on the public distribution system. But let us make no mistake about it. This is not nascent capitalism because there is no private property in North Korea. A certain level of entrepreneurship is allowed, but there is no private property. All you own is the things inside your home. You will hear stories about people buying and driving cars in North Korea, and they're true. You will hear about truckers who make decent money in North Korea, that is true again. But they do not purchase property titles. They purchase the right to drive a vehicle. The vehicle has to be registered under a government agency. You need the protection of government agencies and powerful individuals in order to run your business. It's a very bizarre hybrid of very tight dictatorial state control and some level of private entrepreneurship. As Ambassador Natsios knows, we have translated the North Korean Criminal Code and included it in our reports and posted it on our website. By the way, hrnk.org. Please do friend us on Facebook and social media, an act of shameless self-promotion. If you look at the criminal code, each and every type of entrepreneurial activity is illegal and punishable by at least 3 years in a re-education camp. The level of corruption is unprecedented. So North Korea is basically a very strange hybrid combining totalitarianism and market activity. The real estate market, apartments, believe it or not, in the capital city of Pyongyang sell even for between $100,000 and $200,000, a significant amount of money. But people do not purchase titles. They swap the right to reside in those respective apartments. Again, no private property. But nevertheless, the markets have played a very important role, even socially, because before that, life was focused only on the workplace and the place of residence. Why? Because the state assigns you the workplace assigns you the place of residence. Anything that has to do with sports, soccer games, union meetings, labor union meetings, all kinds of meetings, the weekly ideological training meetings, they were all centered on these two places. What the markets have done has been to change the way North Koreans interact socially. Remember, there is no banking system that these entrepreneurs can rely on. There's no place to borrow, lend money. Everything is based on trust. This was not designed as a trust society. However, in order to engage in these economic activities, people do have to rely on trust. Trust has had to develop amongst the people of North Korea, and perhaps this is one of the most significant aspects in terms of the ways North Korea has changed since the days of the Great Famine. Does dissent exist in North Korea? Come on, do these people ever rebel? They die by the hundreds of thousands and millions, and do they rebel? Well, actually, yes. They do. They have attempted. There have been attempts. For example, in 1990, after the changes in Eastern Europe, Kim Il-sung University students, this is North Korea's top university, they're also sons and daughters of the elites, they tried to distribute leaflets discussing the situation in Eastern Europe. Of course, they were caught, arrested, imprisoned, executed. Perhaps the best known instance happened in 1995 when officers of the 6th and 7th Corps in Cheongjin and Hamhung attempted to organize and plotted to organize a rebellion. Unfortunately for them, of course, they were caught, executed. I have spoken with witnesses who had lived in the area at the time who told me that they could hear the sound of machine guns late into the night, night after night after night. That's how many people were executed at the time. Of course, this is the North Korea that Kim Jongun wants you to see today. This is the North Korea that Kim Jongun wants South Koreans to see beginning this week as they participate in the Pyeongchang Olympics. And I hope that's a topic we can discuss during our question and answer session today. Going back to the elements that have sustained the Kim regime and kept it in power, well, you remember the 3 totalitarian political systems, but in addition to that, the level of indoctrination, the level of brainwashing in Korea is unprecedented in world history. Babies in the cradle are taught to point fingers to the portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il on the wall, so it begins at a pre-cognizant age. This continues throughout one's lifetime, especially during the time when young people are in the military. Young men in North Korea spend 10 years in a KPA uniform, age 17 to 27. Well, now actually 18 to 28 because they have a mandatory 4 years of high school. So high school used to be 3 years, now it's 4 years. They spend 10 years in a military uniform. Many of the women spend 6 years in a military uniform. What is the age of revolution? Think of Budapest, 1956. Prague 1968, Bucharest 1989, late teens, early 20s, mid 20s. At the age of revolution, most young men and many North Korean women are in a military uniform subjected to even more relentless brainwashing. By the time they're done with their military service, the age of revolution has already passed. North Korea is a surveillance state. Everybody conducts surveillance of everybody else. There's always somebody looking over your shoulder. The level of coercion, control, surveillance, and punishment is absolutely unbelievable. For that reason, the level of social cohesion is very low. It's difficult for people to organize, to get together, to discuss sports. Forget about politics. Each and every week they participate in ideological training sessions, Senghwa Tsonghwa. They have to confess to their trespasses. So, comrades, I have been wrong. I've done this, and that wrong. And then somebody in the audience stands up and says, yes, Comrade Lee, you have done this, and that wrong, and don't do it again. And Comrade Lee pledges to intensify his efforts to develop ideologically, and then he picks on somebody else in the audience, but you too, Comrade Kim, have done this, and that wrong for the past week. And this goes on and on. This is part of life in North Korea. Of course, North Korea continues to be the world's most reclusive regime. For a population of 25 million people, they have only 2,000 IP addresses. They do have a cell phone system, about 3.5 million sets in use. It's strictly surveilled, and of course, one cannot use an official North Korean cell phone to make an international call. Foreign residents of North Korea, even if they use a North Korean cell phone, cannot call a North Korean national on a North Korean cell phone because the systems are different. One other fundamental problem is that the elites of North Korea understand that their survival, or believe rather, that their survival depends on the survival of the Kim regime. After all, there was no South Romania, no South and North Bulgaria, or South and North Hungary. In this case, North Korea's elites understand that they're not indispensable, they're disposable, because there's clearly a role model out there, free, democratic, prosperous Republic of Korea, South Korea. Now, of course, there are some good news as well. I have mentioned the markets. Despite flaws and faults, markets do act as an agent of change. It is a very positive development that fewer people depend on the regime for their food and daily necessities and depend on markets instead. Information is penetrating North Korea oftentimes along the informal supply chains established all the way from China to the capital city of Pyongyang. Radio broadcasting by Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, stations based in South Korea, based on surveys of North Korean defectors, 30-40% of them used to listen to foreign radio while in North Korea. The listenership rate has gone up over the years. USBs, DVDs, thumb drives, cheap DVD players are sold at North Korea's black markets. Many more North Koreans today know about South Korea. They're familiar with the Hallyu, South Korean K-pop, the South Korean wave, South Korean soap opera. It's difficult to lie to North Koreans and tell them that South Koreans are an impoverished people shining the boots of American GIs. They kind of know by now. So information will continue to erode the regime's grip on power, slowly but surely. Presumably Christianity. This is also a slow process, but there are churches, faith-based organizations, Christian organizations, very reliable sources actually, from very reliable sources. I do know that there is an underground church in North Korea, despite the dangers faced by these underground Christians. But perhaps given the Christian tradition and history in North Korea, Christianity will also continue to act as one of those elements, slowly but surely eroding the regime's grip on power someday when it gains critical mass. Finally, whenever you see news about North Korea, I think that it is very important to remember the regime's fundamental strategic objectives. Number one, survival. Number two, I know this is going to sound preposterous, but remember, this is not a criminal cartel. This is a criminal monopoly. There is no competition inside North Korea, no political competition. There is only one competitor: free, democratic, prosperous Republic of Korea. The Kim regime understands that for as long as the Republic of Korea exists, the long-term survival of the regime cannot be guaranteed. As preposterous as that might sound, and this does not necessarily involve North Korean tanks rolling down south, this might simply mean a process of Finlandizing South Korea by having South Koreans give up the fundamental liberties that define them as a nation, doing that in order to bring South Korea more within the sphere of influence of the Kim Jong-un regime. Again, I hope we can talk about the Olympics in the Q&A. Of course, strategic objective number three, gaining what they see as international prestige through developing a three-stage long-range ballistic missile capable of reaching the continental United States, the farther the better, all the way to the East Coast. By doing this, they also execute their first two fundamental strategic objectives. Fundamental strategic objective number four, driving a wedge between us, the United States, and our staunch friends, allies, and partners, South Korea. They're right in the midst of doing that right now. Two examples. As talks about the Olympics were initiated, the South Koreans tried to bring up nuclear weapons. They said, no. Nuclear weapons are not directed against you, our brothers and sisters, or the Chinese, or the Russians. We target the Americans, your allies, your friends. It's as simple as that. They've just announced that as part of this large North Korean delegation traveling to South Korea, 600 people accompanying 20 athletes, Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, she's 30 years old, she will be going to South Korea. Isn't that a wonderful thing that his sister will be there? Not really, not according to the U.S. Treasury Department and the U.S. State Department. She's on the list of human rights violators that are supposed to be subjected to international sanctions. By doing this, Kim Jong-un is trying to find and attack a vulnerable spot in the international sanctions regime, and also to drive a wedge between our friends in South Korea and us, the United States of America. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Greg, for that very depressing,
You're welcome, Andrew.
but brilliant description of what's going on in North Korea and why we got where we are today. This is not just a human rights question. It is perhaps the first national security issue for the United States right now, because the North Koreans are developing weapons that can reach the United States. I've been interviewed, I think, twice on Austin radio when Kim Jong-un had a picture of Austin where this was like 3 years ago, he was targeting it. And they said, can he reach it? I said, well, right now he cannot reach it, so don't get upset yet. So at some point, they will have the capacity to get to the United States. Now, traditional deterrent theory says if all actors are rational actors, that is to say they act in their own self-interest, that deterrence works, which is to say the massive military capacity and strategic capacity of the United States and our missiles, our submarine launched missiles, our land-based missiles, and our bombers could level North Korea. Condi Rice said to me once, we can make North Korea into a parking lot very quickly. Now, that presumes first that they are rational actors. I actually think they are, within their own context. The larger question for me, frankly, is not North Korea. North Korea, I don't think, is going to launch an attack against the United States. I think that's unlikely. It is that we decide that this is too much of a threat. We launch and this is being discussed seriously in Washington, very seriously in Washington now, a bloody nose, which would be a strike against against a nuclear facility, but we don't know where they all are. And so it's very clear, even if we launched an attack, we would not destroy all our facilities. They're dug underneath mountains, and we're not sure where all of them are. The larger question is China has a treaty, 1956 Mutual Defense Treaty with North Korea. Last August, perhaps the most significant thing, in my view, that's happened in the last 2 years, is China issued a profound statement. They said, if North Korea attacks the United States or her allies first, we will not defend North Korea. If, however, they attack North Korea first, we will defend them. So the Chinese don't have a few weapons. They have a lot of weapons. And having a nuclear exchange with China would be catastrophic for the world and for us. So my question to you is, Greg, even if they are rational actors, are they rational in the traditional understanding of deterrence? I mean, rational actors in the North Korean context may not be rational actors in the sense of international relations theory. Two, what will the Chinese do? Where are the Chinese in all of this? They're clearly nervous, but they haven't done enough to force the North Koreans into giving up their weapons. Why aren't they?
They are a rational actor. Perhaps somewhere down the line we will come to the realization that the only way to address North Korea is the good old way of the Cold War, through deterrence, containment, and through information campaigns aimed to empower the people of North Korea, who can really be the only agents of change. All of this combined with much improved missile defense at our end as well. After all, they now have the Hwasong-15, which, if one looks at the size of the dome, it can possibly carry up to 3 nuclear warheads, countermeasures. We are dealing with a new level of threat here. We are aware of the extraordinary cost of a second Korean War. 80% of North Korea's 1.2 million men and women in uniform are forward deployed, poised to attack south of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. 400,000 light infantry ready to pour down south, 100,000 special forces, 10,000 artillery pieces, 1,000 ballistic missiles, chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons. Half the population of South Korea lives in Seoul and in the satellite cities, 25 million. There are more Americans living in South Korea than in Buffalo, New York. So I would argue that while they're a staunch friend and ally, this is the homeland to us. So, because the military planners would be unable to anticipate the scale of escalation, if hit by a surgical strike, it is quite likely that they would interpret this as the first stage in a campaign to remove the regime by force. Thus, they might initiate their own plan to acquire control of the peninsula by force. So where is China in all of this? To China, North Korea continues to be a buffer zone, an ally, a satellite state. After all, they were the ones who ensured the survival of the Kim regime during the Korean War and after that. To China, North Korea is a bargaining chip, a buffer zone, and it's part of the greater game that China is playing in the South China Sea and elsewhere. Although they're very annoyed by the Kim Jong-un regime, and there have been ups and downs in Sino-DPRK relations, they have not reached the point where they're ready to change their fundamental strategic stance on North Korea. They will continue to protect this regime. What is China's red line? Of course, China understands that this is a criminal regime. But for as long as Kim Jong-un manages to keep North Korea together, for as long as Kim Jong-un manages to keep North Korea within the Chinese sphere of influence, he will be left alone. The red line would be, presumably, loss of control. So China is in a position where it is participating in Security Council action. It has not, of course, vetoed Security Council resolutions aiming to do away with the development and proliferation of North Korean nukes and missiles. But at the same time, China doesn't seem to be terribly bothered by the North Korean nuclear program. And there are organizations such as C4ADS in Washington, D.C., that have documented material support coming from China, material support extended to North Korea's missile and nuclear program based on information collected from open sources, YouTube videos, trade shows. So this does not necessarily mean that this is a centrally directed effort. It may be just rogue agents. China is now a little bit more serious about implementing the sanctions regime against North Korea, but still not fully committed to anything that might jeopardize the survival of the Kim Jongun regime.
The International Institute for Strategic Studies in London issued a report, I think within the last 6 months, in which they said that the missile technology being used to deliver the nuclear weapons that North Korea's developed could not have been developed without either Ukrainian or Russian parts, in other words, technology. And part of the reason that the Russians have been spreading rumors that the Ukrainians is to embarrass the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government would never do that on its own. That doesn't mean the defense industry in Ukraine wouldn't have done it, but the Russians might well have done it. What is the Russian role in all of this?
I think that the Russian role has been grossly underestimated during the post-Cold War period. The Russian Federation has always had a very significant diplomatic presence in Pyongyang. There are about 150 people, I believe, including family members at the Russian embassy there. That's a very serious presence. During the regime of Kim Jong-il, the Russian ambassador and Kim Jong-il used to play billiard twice a month. Anything that's a thorn in the side of the United States will be a good thing to the Russians. So they have continued to be enablers of the Kim regime. Of course, North Korea shares most of its northern border with China, about 17 kilometers of border with Russia. But just a couple of years ago, the Russians reverted to the use of Russian rubles in trade with North Korea. It had been dollars since the end of the Cold War. Russia hosts many of those North Korean workers officially dispatched overseas to earn hard currency for the regime. Many of them are in the eastern cities of Khabarovsk, Vladivostok as construction workers, some of them as loggers at logging camps in Russia. So, and also we have had reports that Russia is helping bypass the sanctions by basically...
Even though they did not veto the sanctions.
They did not veto the sanctions, but they allow oil to be exported to North Korea. We remember that the South Koreans seized 2 ships that were smuggling oil into North Korea. So they have continued to support them. I have experienced this up close and personal. We have a pending application for consultative status at the UN with ECOSOC.
We being the Committee on Human Rights.
The Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. So I was there, I was in New York City. I requested meetings with country missions.
We didn't get status. The regimes that vetoed our presence as an NGO were some of the great regimes of the world, the human rights regimes in the world. I'm being sarcastic now.
Russia, China, Iran, Burundi, Cuba, Venezuela. Basically, our only allies there were Israel, Greece, and Turkey. So that said, Russia has been the leader of this anti-NGO campaign at the NGO committee. They never miss an opportunity to protect their North Korean friends. I don't think they dispute the facts, but because by now we all know, we've heard from the witnesses, we've seen the satellite images, but nevertheless, they continue to extend protection at international organizations, and they continue to engage in economic exchanges, and they continue to help in basically undermining and bypassing the sanctions regime.
Now tell us, this will be my last question before we open it up, but what happened with the Olympics is quite remarkable. One, the South Korean government did not tell us they were engaged with these negotiations, but 2, tell us about the arrangements the South Koreans agreed to in terms of their own participation in their own country in the Olympics.
So Andrew, you and I agree that peace is a wonderful thing, reconciliation is a wonderful thing, and unification is not a matter of choice, but the destiny of Koreans. But unification under a free, democratic, prosperous ROK, Republic of Korea. So the concessions made by the South Korean side are quite mind-boggling, I have to say. Of course, the two Koreas marched together at the opening ceremony during the 2000 and 2004 Summer Olympics and the 2006 Winter Olympics. They marched under the same flag, the blue peninsula on a white background flag, and that is okay, but these Olympic Games are hosted by the Republic of Korea. They will march together, but they will not be flying the Taegukgi, the ROK flag. They will be flying the peninsula flag, and South Korea is the host of these Olympic Games. They will not be playing the South Korean national anthem. They will be playing Arirang, which is a wonderful song, one of the oldest and best known folk songs in Korea, but this is not the national anthem of the Republic of Korea. They sent South Korean athletes, skiers, to train at a ski resort in North Korea, Mashingyeong Pass Ski Resort, built pursuant to Kim Jongun's order, by the way, built with forced labor. Soldiers built it, children worked there as well. South Korean athletes going there had to remove their ROK flag shoulder patches. On the other hand, the North Koreans who are in South Korea continue to wear their Kim Il-sung badges. You might think that these are small matters. They're not. Because what's happening in South Korea is really a battle and a struggle over legitimacy. In 1980, when South Korea was an authoritarian country, military dictatorship, you're all familiar with the 1980 uprising in Gwangju, when civilians were killed in South Korea. That's when South Korean legitimacy was at the lowest point. However, the legitimacy of the Republic of Korea has continued to increase, and I will argue that following the 2014 report of the UN Commission of Inquiry, the legitimacy gap between the two Koreas has been tremendous. The Republic of Korea, fully responsible member of the international community, the DPRK, a regime that commits crimes against humanity against its own citizens. Now, both Koreas are engaged in an effort to sanitize the image of the Kim Jong-un regime. So basically they had two athletes that qualified. They missed the October 26th deadline. They were accepted by the International Olympic Committee. The South Koreans opened up some of their teams, including the women's ice hockey team. Some of those young women worked very hard, dreaming of Pyeongchang, of their Olympic Games. Of course, they were kicked off the team because North Koreans had to be brought on for political reasons, but it's okay. President Moon Jae-in of South Korea met with them and told them, you were chosen because we thought you didn't have a chance to win a medal anyway. That must have made them feel much, much better. So you're talking about 20 North Korean athletes. They're sending a delegation of 600 people. Cheerleaders, 240 or 260 cheerleaders, an orchestra, 140 people, minders, security agents. They have sent their own ferry to port. They've asked the South Koreans for fuel. Remember, fuel is subjected to UN Security Council sanctions. Of course, the South Koreans will have to make a payment. Is that a breach of the sanctions? Perhaps. This lady who's very famous in North Korea, a member of the Morambong band, these young women singers, they play the guitar. The whole South Korean press was focused, oh, she's pretty, she's not pretty, she's wearing Chanel, she's not wearing Chanel. The point is that she's a vice director in the propaganda and agitation department, which is a very important position. Kim Jong-un has just decided, they've announced that his own sister, Kim Yo-jong, will be traveling to South Korea, as I mentioned earlier, which is a big problem because she's one of the persons who are on the list of human rights violators. She was in charge of propaganda and agitation. This is the department that's primarily in charge of cracking down on information from the outside world. People get arrested and punished if they get caught. 3 years in a re-education camp or worse, depending on the circumstances. So, while national reconciliation is a great thing, I would argue that there is a silent majority in South Korea. You will see the president's approval ratings as very high. They're dropping a bit right now. But there is a silent majority that's profoundly disenchanted with this abandonment of national symbols and distinctive features of Republic of Korea national identity. There are conservatives demonstrating in the streets of South Korea. They're trying to burn portraits of Kim Jongun and North Korean flags. The South Korean cops wouldn't let them do that, while the North Koreans are wearing Kim Il-sung badges. I think that's a fairly big deal, and I'm quite worried about this.
Questions? Yes, sir.
So I was curious about if you can compare the European encounter with North Korea versus Americans. I was just actually looking online, Sweden, France, Germany, UK, as well as China and Russia. They all have embassies in North Korea. And so why North Korea is threatening America but not the Europeans?
Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland as well. France actually only has a cultural mission. They were contemplating the establishment of a diplomatic mission, but what had happened was that a French historian, Pierre Rigoulot, a friend of ours, had published The Aquariums of Pyongyang, a book about the life of Kang Teol-hwan, a former political prisoner at Camp Number 15, and the French people and the French government said, diplomatic representation, maybe not. We'll send an Alliance Française, a cultural mission. Well, the Kim regime is all built on a guerrilla mentality. It's us against the world. Americans are the enemy. Everything they do is to instill this siege mentality into the hearts and minds of their people. They teach them that America is their greatest enemy. They don't like anybody else that much, quite honestly. Earlier today, while speaking to one of your classes here, we're discussing how Kim Il-sung knew how to play the Soviets against the Chinese against the Soviets, and thus extract maximum benefits. So why is it that they don't have a problem with the Europeans? Although many Europeans were contributing nations to the Korean War, it goes back to legitimacy. The one and only threat to the survival of the Kim regime is the very existence of the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea has been protected by their friend, the United States of America. We have a very strong US-ROC alliance. South Koreans are wonderful soldiers, and for a variety of very good reasons, they do need to continue to rely on the US-ROC alliance for the survival of the Republic. They have a problem with America because we continue to help South Korea continue to survive, and not only survive, thrive as a democracy and as an economic powerhouse.
Other questions? And there's no alliances with Europe. I mean, I think what Greg's point
Right.
is there's a military alliance with South Korea and the United States. There is no military alliance that threatens the North Koreans between the South Korea and Europe.
And also remember that some of these European nations have had relations with the DPRK since its establishment, since 1948. The Poles, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, 3 out of 7 European nations that have embassies in Pyongyang. The North Koreans have always liked Sweden because they somehow think of themselves as the Sweden of Northeast Asia. If we could only do things a little bit better, we could be Sweden. Kim Jong-un has his Pyongjin policy line of developing both nuclear weapons and the economy. Has done very well on nuclear weapons, not so well on the economy. There is a very interesting story about Sweden. By the way, whenever Americans are taken hostage by the North Koreans, we do not have diplomatic representation, so it's the Swedes who represent the interests of US citizens in the DPRK. In the 1970s, they imported a batch of Volvos from Sweden. You can still see some of these old Volvos in North Korea here and there, and then they refused to pay. They never paid. They just took the Volvos. These things happen, right?
Other questions? Yes, sir.
So if the talks that President Moon is hoping come from the North's participation in the Olympics don't happen, will he take a harder stance on North Korea, or since he's more liberal than President Park was, is he still going to continue to try and reconcile with the North?
He faces a fairly serious risk politically in South Korea. And now the North Koreans have taken him hostage. He has overinvested in rapprochement with North Korea. For that reason, they're pressing him very hard. Again, the fellow is sending his sister, who's on the sanctioned individuals list. What are you going to do? Are you with the UN? Are you with the others? Are you with us? Make your choice. Well, combined exercises have been postponed. I am very sure that somewhere down the line, perhaps during the Olympics, they will ask for the cancellation of combined exercises between the United States and the Republic of Korea. We cannot do that. Why is it that we cannot do that? Because these exercises are critical to preparedness. The US-ROC alliance, the US-Japan alliance are the cornerstone of peace, security, and prosperity in Northeast Asia and the Asia-Pacific and beyond. If we are to send, I will say you, our brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, parents, to fight alongside our South Korean allies, we want to know that you have the best chance to fight, win, and survive, and the only way of doing that is by training together. North Koreans have their own cycles, military training cycles in the winter and in the summer. You hear talks about a freeze for freeze. The North Koreans freezing their nuclear weapons program, us suspending military exercises. That's sheer nonsense. It's simply a matter of making unilateral concessions while they get to keep all of their weapons. So President Moon Jae-in has dug himself a pretty deep hole. Now, of course, a significant part of his support base will continue to be behind him, and some of those advising him actually have a history of fairly radical pro-North Korean views, and they're in senior positions.
One of them couldn't get a visa to come to the United States because he was regarded as
You're talking
compromised.
You're talking about the chief of staff, the presidential chief of staff, who has indeed this history. Others who delivered $500 million in cash to Kim Jong-il to set up the summit meeting to Kim Dae-jung. Of course, people change. Of course, reality checks happen. But this history is there, and these personalities are still there. I'm quite worried about what's going to happen on the Korean Peninsula for the next few weeks.
Other questions?
What effect does Trump's travel ban on North Koreans have on the refugee crisis and then on the elites and the sanctions?
Well, the travel ban on North Koreans has just been lifted, so the travel ban no longer affects North Koreans. Regrettably, the number of North Korean refugees has always been very low here in the United States. North Koreans began coming to the United States after the passage of the 2004 U.S.-North Korea Human Rights Act. The act was reauthorized in 2008 and 2012. The new act, the reauthorization, has passed the House. It's pending in the Senate. So since 2004, fewer than 220 North Koreans have resettled here in the United States. The main reason behind this, well, there are many reasons. Remember, North Koreans are subjected to relentless indoctrination. They fear America. They're not mentally prepared to come to America. They receive a lot of allowances, resettlement allowance if they go to South Korea. These are two very different countries, but nevertheless, they speak the same language. The culture is perhaps still somehow similar despite differences that have developed for the past 70 years. The debriefing process, once one submits an application, the debriefing process takes much longer for one who wants to come to the United States. And thus, for a variety of reasons, they choose to go to South Korea rather than come here to the United States.
This young lady back here. Metra, is it Metra?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So it was in the news a few weeks ago that President Trump actually said it would be a good thing about the discussion between North Korea and South Korea. So I was wondering, do you see any change in U.S. policy to mitigate somehow the sanctions and stuff in the future? Do you see any willingness within President Trump's team to, I don't know, to be softer with North Korea or anything in this regard?
I think that President Trump and the Trump administration have effectively applied two elements of national power: economic power through the application of sanctions with a bite. The sanctions regime, pursuant to UN Security Council resolutions, is stronger today than it was 2 years ago. It now includes the exportation of coal and minerals, which are the mainstay of North Korea's exports. It addresses the importation of oil into North Korea. By the way, it does not include food, although seafood is indeed subjected to sanctions. North Korea is a fairly significant exporter of seafood to China in particular. But the economic element of national power has been effectively applied. The military element of national power through the deployment of assets to the region, through reinforcing the strength of our alliances with South Korea and Japan. These are all moves that are not meant to start a second Korean War, but to prevent a second Korean War from happening. We could do much better in terms of our information element of national power. Investment in information campaigns in North Korea has been dismal. Really, really small amounts. Organizations doing this really need support. They need the support of the US government. And there is room left for the diplomatic element of national power as well. President Moon Jae-in called President Trump to request his help for a successful Olympics. The ticket sales were a bit sluggish. They were having some trouble. President Trump agreed to postpone combined exercises until April the 1st, until after the Olympics. He offered to send a high-level delegation led by Vice President Pence, and he offered to include members of his own family in this delegation, while at the same time waiting on the sidelines, standing on the sidelines, watching these exchanges between South and North Korea. So I don't think we have signaled to the South Koreans that we are against inter-Korean dialogue and exchanges, as you said. Under the current circumstances, again, dialogue is not a terrible thing, for as long as our friends in South Korea are fully aware of the perils involved in this process. And the North Koreans will indeed push very hard.
Could you speak to some of the economic policies that Kim Jong-un or North Korea has tried to implement, either successful or unsuccessful?
Very little has been done in terms of economic policy. Again, the main policy line of Kim Jong-un is the Pyongyang line of developing both the economy and nuclear weapons. You will see pictures, I should have brought a few with me today, you will see pictures of high-risers in the capital city of Pyongyang. They're quite stunning. It's quite stunning that you see these buildings there. They're buildings that have very little economic utility. They're simply meant to enhance the prestige of the Kim regime. And here is where the nexus between human rights and political security challenges comes into place. The Kim regime wants to survive. In order to survive, it prioritizes its resources. It invests in 3 areas that it regards as critical to its survival: nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and the key elites that are critical in maintaining the regime in power. It wants to give them access to hard currency. It wants to give them access to luxury goods from the outside world. It also invests in these high-profile projects that make you believe that there is economic growth in North Korea. Believe me, I grew up in communist Romania. The humanitarian situation and the human rights situation were absolutely appalling, while the regime was starving its own people in order to build these humongous structures that look just like Pyongyang. You have been there.
Ceausescu's palace.
Exactly, Ceausescu's palace. Yeah. So if such signs are interpreted as economic growth, I think that is a mistake. In terms of fundamental economic policy, there have been no significant changes, with one exception in agriculture, where now families are allowed to organize as a working unit, and where agricultural workers are allowed to keep up to 1/3 of their produce. But remember, this is a command economy. If your production target changes the following week, that 30% is no longer 30%. Again, entrepreneurship exists in North Korea. North Koreans are extraordinary people. They're extraordinary survivors. Kim Jong-un has allowed entrepreneurship. You are allowed to make money, not too much. How much is too much? Nobody knows. And we've had interns and friends whose fathers and mothers were in this position where they were purged because they had made too much, but nobody knows exactly how much is too much.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
How significant do you think the recent troubles, diplomatic troubles between South Korea and Japan have helped North Korea reposition himself politically?
South Korea-Japan relations, managing South Korea-Japan relations from the South Korean and the Japanese viewpoint is a little bit, as one of my good friends once put it, like driving a car down a country road full of potholes. You're supposed to go around the potholes, but both sides go right through the potholes, unfortunately. So there are issues that are seemingly insurmountable that keep being brought up and used, abused, and misused for political purposes. One of them is the island of Tokto, for example, which is Korean territory. It's known in Japan as Takeshima. On world maps, it's still known as the Liancourt Rocks. I mean, undeniably, indisputably, this is Korean territory. But of course, the issue is misused on the Japanese side. It's played up on the Korean side as well. For example, when President Trump visited South Korea during the summit meeting, he was served Tokto shrimp. I'm not sure that we had advance notice or whether we're blindsided. I just don't know. I don't have access to that level. The issue of sexual slavery during the Japanese occupation period, of course, was a very serious issue. Yes, crimes were committed, and perhaps Japan can do more in order to atone and reconcile with the tragic past. This issue keeps being brought up in South Korea, especially under the current administration. Again, these are old women, these are victims, full respect for all of them. At the same time, the issue has been used and abused. When President Trump went to Japan, he met with a group of family members of abductee families. This is an issue we haven't discussed today. South Korean, Japanese, and nationals of other countries abducted by North Korea. In South Korea, he met with a comfort woman, an old lady. I'm not sure that he knew who he was. Of course, he hugged her, and that was a moment that perhaps added to tension between South Korea and Japan. Again, these are natural allies. South Korea and Japan, they do have a lot in common, and we do hope that they will find ways to overcome these historic differences and be even more proactive in trilateral coordination with the United States.
One more question. Is there a young woman who has a question? No? The gentleman back here, right at the back.
You mentioned the Chinese reinforcement of the at least unilateral defensive pact with North Korea. Given that so much of Chinese growth recently has been due to economic exchange with the West, do you think they would risk not only a kinetic exchange with the United States, but losing the economic boon of trade with the West to preserve a buffer state?
Yes, absolutely. Being a world power means more than just trade and a prosperous economy. Again, China is a superpower at the height of its prowess in modern and contemporary times. China is not ready to give up on its North Korean ally. They did not give up on them in 1950. They have not given up on them since 1953, despite very tense moments in Sino-DPRK relations. They will not give up on them under any circumstances other than the North Koreans themselves initiating a conflict. And of course, that would be a different set of circumstances.
Right. Thank you all for coming this evening.